A cargo ship docks at a major port. Cranes lift box after steel box onto the waiting trucks below, and if you could check the manufacturing plate on almost every single one of them, they'd all trace back to factories inside one country. That is real. It exists. It's been independently verified by government investigators on multiple continents, and the actual number is even more extreme than most people assume. More than 95% of the world's dry cargo containers, and functionally all of its refrigerated ones. Every figure in this video comes from government trade investigations, verified industry reporting, and court filings from an active federal case, because a dominance this total, in an industry this essential to global trade, deserves a real explanation, not just a shocking headline. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how one country built a stranglehold this complete, and why Western governments are now treating it as a genuine national security concern. Here's the number worth sitting with before anything else, because it's easy to read past a statistic like 95% without actually registering how extreme it is. According to a formal investigation by the United States Federal Maritime Commission, just 3 major Chinese companies alone manufacture close to 82% of the entire world's shipping containers. And once you include the country's smaller manufacturers, China's total share crosses 95% for standard dry cargo containers, and by some industry counts, essentially 100% of the refrigerated containers, known in the industry as reefers, that keep everything from vaccines to fresh produce cold on their way across an ocean. Here's what makes that number genuinely different from ordinary manufacturing dominance in other industries. This isn't a country simply outcompeting rivals on price in a niche product category. It's a single nation manufacturing nearly every one of the estimated 44 million standard shipping containers currently in active global circulation, the literal steel boxes that roughly 90% of the entire world's traded goods pass through at some point on their journey from factory to shelf. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. Whether you're looking at a Maersk logo, an MSC logo, or a Costco logo painted on the side of a container, the box itself was almost certainly built in China, regardless of which shipping company's name is stenciled across it. Here's where this story actually has to start. Because China wasn't always the country holding this position, and understanding who it displaced is the key to understanding how deliberately this dominance was actually built. Here's the backstory. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, container manufacturing was led by a different set of Asian producers entirely, with South Korean companies like Jindo standing among the dominant global names in the industry, manufacturing hundreds of thousands of containers annually and supplying much of the world's shipping fleet. Here's the mechanism behind how China actually took that position away, and it started with a joint venture rather than a hostile takeover. China International Marine Containers, now universally known by its acronym CIMC, was founded in 1980 in Shenzhen as a joint venture specifically involving a Danish shipping partner, giving the young Chinese company direct access to established container engineering knowledge and international shipping industry relationships right from its earliest days, rather than having to build that expertise entirely from scratch. Here's the number that shows just how thoroughly China's rise displaced its South Korean predecessors. By 1996, CIMC alone had already become the single largest container manufacturer in the world by volume, and the broader shift proved permanent rather than temporary. Jindo's own annual production plateaued around 160,000 20-foot equivalent units in the year 2000 and never meaningfully grew again, while Chinese manufacturers kept expanding output year after year, permanently taking market share that South Korean producers were never able to win back. Here's the mechanism behind exactly how CIMC turned early momentum into total industry dominance. Because a joint venture head start alone doesn't explain a 95% global market share. Here's a critical acquisition that mattered enormously to CIMC's technical credibility. The company acquired a 60% shareholding in Clive Smith Cowley, a British company that had invented a proprietary domino folding technology, allowing empty shipping containers to be collapsed flat for more efficient, cheaper transport when they needed to be repositioned without cargo inside, instantly giving CIMC access to genuine Western engineering innovation rather than simply competing on manufacturing cost alone. Think about what owning that kind of proprietary technology actually did for CIMC's competitive position. It meant the company wasn't just the cheapest option in the market, it was simultaneously setting new technical standards the rest of the industry increasingly had to follow, combining low-cost manufacturing with genuine engineering leadership in the exact same company. Here's the deeper structural advantage sitting underneath all of this, one that had almost nothing to do with any single company's individual strategy. China produces more raw steel than every other country on Earth combined, with the World Steel Association recording Chinese crude steel production reaching roughly 1 billion tons in a recent year, more than 10 times the output of India, the world's second largest producer. representing over 50% of the entire planet's total steel production. Here's why that steel dominance matters so specifically for container manufacturing. A standard 20-foot shipping container uses roughly 2 tons of a specific weathering steel called Corten steel in its construction, meaning any company building containers anywhere in the world needs reliable, affordable access to exactly the kind of steel China already produces domestically in overwhelming volume, at a cost structure no steel importing country can easily match. Here's the part of this story that explains why this dominance has proven so difficult for any competitor to challenge, even decades later. The economics of building a container factory outside China have become genuinely self-reinforcing, rather than simply a matter of labor costs. Here's the mechanism behind that self-reinforcing trap. Building a container in Europe or the United States today would typically require importing the necessary steel from China in the first place, paying tariffs on that imported steel, running it through a domestic factory, and then shipping the finished empty container back across the ocean toward Asia, specifically to be loaded with the goods it was actually built to carry. A logistical loop that adds cost and complexity at nearly every single step, when a container built in China simply starts its working life already sitting exactly where the cargo it needs to carry actually originates. Here's the industry pattern that reinforces this even further. Container manufacturing has historically clustered geographically alongside a country's broader retail product manufacturing base, meaning as China became the dominant manufacturing hub for the actual consumer goods filling those containers, building the containers themselves in the exact same country became the obvious, lowest friction choice for the entire global shipping industry, rather than a decision anyone had to force. Think about what that clustering effect actually creates over time. It's not simply that China makes containers more cheaply, it's that the entire physical and economic logic of global trade increasingly assumes the box and the cargo inside it both start their journey from roughly the same place. Here's the structure of exactly who holds this dominance today, because it isn't spread evenly across many small independent Chinese companies. It's concentrated inside a small handful of major manufacturers, and nearly every one of them has direct ties back to the Chinese state. CIMC itself remains the largest single player, commanding somewhere between 40 and over 50% of the global market depending on the specific year and product category measured. And its largest shareholder today is China Merchants Group, a major state-owned conglomerate, meaning the world's dominant container manufacturer isn't simply a private Chinese business succeeding on its own merits. It's substantially owned and controlled by the Chinese government itself. Here's the second largest name in this industry, Dongfang International Containers, commonly known as DFIC, which operates as a direct subsidiary of COSCO Shipping Development, itself part of the larger, fully state-owned China COSCO Shipping Group, one of the largest shipping conglomerates on Earth. Here's the third major player rounding out this picture, CXIC Group Containers, a state-owned subsidiary of the China Shipping Group, which at one point accounted for roughly 10% of the entire global container market on its own, while also separately owning and operating its own container shipping fleet, ranking among the largest container shipping lines in the world in its own right. Here's what that combined ownership structure actually reveals once you look at all three companies side by side. This isn't a story about 3 separate competing private Chinese businesses that each happen to succeed independently. It's a story about a handful of companies with direct, documented lines back to Chinese state ownership, collectively controlling the manufacturing of the literal physical infrastructure that global trade depends on to function at all. Before going any further into where this concentration of control has actually led, it's worth pulling back and understanding why Western governments started treating this specific industry as more than just an ordinary manufacturing story. In 2022, Carl Bensel, then a sitting commissioner at the United States Federal Maritime Commission, published a 28-page report following a year-long investigation specifically into the level of control Chinese companies hold over the manufacturing of both shipping containers and intermodal trailer chassis, the wheeled frames that carry containers by road once they leave a port. Here's the number from that investigation that shocked officials even inside the shipping industry itself. The report found that China doesn't just dominate container manufacturing, it also produces roughly 86% of the world's intermodal trailer chassis, meaning the concentration of control extends well beyond the shipping container itself into the entire physical apparatus needed to actually move that container inland once it reaches a port. This is not a narrow, single-product manufacturing advantage confined to one specific item. This is control over an entire connected supply chain of physical hardware. The box and the wheeled platform that carries the box, both concentrated inside the same country's manufacturing base simultaneously. And once regulators started treating that combined concentration as a genuine strategic vulnerability, rather than simply an interesting statistic, one specific corporate deal became the flashpoint that turned quiet concern into direct government intervention. Here's the deal that actually escalated this from a policy report into a real regulatory fight. In September of 2021, Maersk, the world's second largest shipping company, agreed to sell its own container manufacturing division, Maersk Container Industry, specifically known for producing high-quality refrigerated containers, to CIMC for a purchase price of nearly $1 billion. Here's why that specific sale alarmed regulators so directly. Refrigerated containers already sat close to fully dominated by Chinese manufacturing before this deal was even proposed, and Maersk's own refrigerated container division represented one of the last remaining pieces of that specific market, not already under direct Chinese corporate control. Here's what the United States Department of Justice actually did about it. In August of 2022, the Antitrust Division formally blocked the sale, explicitly arguing that allowing the deal to proceed would concentrate more than 90% of the entire world's refrigerated container production directly inside the hands of state-owned or state-controlled Chinese entities. Think about the significance of a government stepping in to block a corporate sale specifically over a shipping container business, an industry most people never think about at all. This wasn't a decision made over consumer electronics, semiconductors, or fighter jets. It was made over the humble, unglamorous steel box that carries frozen food and life-saving medicine across the ocean. And regulators still judge the resulting concentration of control serious enough to intervene directly and stop the transaction entirely. Here's the escalation that turns this entire story from a slow-building policy concern into something considerably more serious. And it's happening right now rather than sitting safely in the past. According to recent reporting, United States prosecutors have formally charged CIMC, Singamus Container Holdings, Dongfang International Containers, and CXIC Group Containers, collectively representing the overwhelming majority of the entire global container manufacturing industry, with conspiring together to restrict output and fix prices on standardized shipping containers. Here's the number that shows just how seriously prosecutors are treating this case. One senior executive named in the case, Vic Nam Hing Ma, a marketing director at Singamas, was arrested in France on April 14th, with his extradition to the United States currently pending, while 6 additional co-defendants remain at large, including Singamas' own chairman and chief executive, Seong Seng Teo, and CIMC's former president and chief executive, Bo Liang Mai. Think about who Teo specifically is within this industry before this case broke. He's one of the most recognized names in Singapore's shipping sector, having previously led the Singapore Shipping Association for years and separately serving as a member of the Singaporean Parliament through 2014, meaning this isn't an obscure regional case involving minor industry players. It involves some of the most senior, established names in global container shipping, now facing active international fugitive status over allegations of coordinated price fixing across virtually the entire global supply of shipping containers. Here's the honest concession worth including directly, because a fair explanation of this dominance has to acknowledge where genuine competition is actually starting to emerge, even if it remains modest so far. According to industry analysis, manufacturers in Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, and other lower-cost Asian economies are actively positioning themselves to chip away at China's market share, specifically pitching competitive pricing and, in some cases, closer physical proximity to key regional shipping hubs as their main advantages against the entrenched Chinese manufacturing base. Here's why that emerging competition, while genuinely real, hasn't meaningfully dented China's overall dominance yet. None of these countries currently possess anything close to China's raw steel production capacity, meaning any container manufacturer setting up shop in Vietnam or Bangladesh still typically has to import a large share of its core steel input from the exact same Chinese supply chain it's nominally trying to compete against, undercutting much of the cost advantage that would otherwise make relocating manufacturing genuinely attractive. Here's the broader strategic pattern this entire story actually reflects. According to reporting on China's own industrial policy, the Chinese government has recognized the strategic value of maritime and shipping dominance since the earliest years of global containerization back in the 1970s, and more recently folded container and shipping infrastructure directly into the country's broader Made in China 2025 industrial strategy, treating dominance over the literal physical containers of global trade not as an accident of market economics, but as a deliberate long-term strategic objective pursued alongside China's much more widely discussed ambitions in semiconductors, electric vehicles, and advanced robotics. So here's the full picture, start to finish. South Korean manufacturers like Jindo once led the global container industry, until CIMC, founded in 1980 as a Danish joint venture and later backed by state-owned China Merchants Group, systematically outbuilt them using a combination of acquired Western engineering technology, unmatched access to domestic Chinese steel, and manufacturing economics that made building containers anywhere else increasingly illogical. That dominance concentrated into just a handful of companies: CIMC, DFIC, CXIC, and Singamus, nearly all of them directly tied to Chinese state ownership, collectively producing more than 95% of the world's dry containers and effectively all of its refrigerated ones, alongside 86% of the trailer chassis needed to move those containers by road. That concentration grew serious enough that the U.S. Department of Justice directly blocked a near billion-dollar acquisition specifically to prevent Chinese entities from controlling over 90% of global refrigerated container production. And it's now serious enough that federal prosecutors have charged the industry's largest manufacturers with actively conspiring to fix prices, sending some of shipping's most senior executives into international fugitive status. What you're actually looking at across this entire story is the same pattern that's played out in industry after industry over the past 3 decades. A country identifying an unglamorous, overlooked piece of global infrastructure nobody else was paying close enough attention to, and quietly, deliberately building total control over it, one factory and one acquisition at a time, until the rest of the world woke up one day to discover the box. Everything else in the global economy travels. Inside of only comes from one place: